Duel on Syrtis by Powell Anderson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. Duel on Syrtis by Powell Anderson. Bold and ruthless, he was famed throughout the system as a big game hunter. From the fire drakes of Mercury to the ice crawlers of Pluto, he'd slain them all. But his trophy room lacked one item, and now Riordan swore he'd bagged the forbidden game that roamed the red deserts. A Martian. The night whispered the message. Over the many miles of loneliness it was borne, carried on the wind, rustled by the half-sentient lichens and the dwarfed trees, murmured from one to another of the little creatures that huddled under crags, in caves, by shadowy dunes. In no words, but in a dim pulsing of dread which echoed through Kreega's brain, the warning ran: "They are hunting again." Kreega shuddered in a sudden blast of wind. The night was enormous around him, above him, from the iron bitterness of the hills to the wheeling, glittering constellations light years over his head. He reached out with his trembling perceptions, tuning himself to the brush and the wind and the small burrowing things underfoot, letting the night speak to him. Alone. Alone. There was not another Martian for 100 miles of emptiness. There were only the tiny animals and the shivering brush and the thin, sad blowing of the wind. The voiceless scream of dying traveled through the brush, from plant to plant, echoed by the fear pulses of the animals and the ringingly reflected cliffs. They were curling, shriveling, and blackening as the rocket poured the glowing death down on them, and the withering veins and nerves cried to the stars. Kreega huddled against a tall, gaunt crag. His eyes were like yellow moons in the darkness, cold with terror and hate and a slowly gathering resolution. Grimly he estimated that the death was being sprayed in a circle some 10 miles across, and he was trapped in it, and soon the hunter would come after him. He looked up to the indifferent glitter of stars, and a shudder went along his body. Then he sat down and began to think. It had started a few days before in the private office of the trader Wisby. "I came to Mars," said Riordan, "to get me an owlie." Wisby had learned the value of a poker face. He peered across the rim of his glasses at the other man, estimating him. Even in God-forsaken holes like Port Armstrong one had heard of Riordan, heir to a $1 million shipping firm which he himself had pyramided into a system-wide monster. He was equally well known as a big game hunter. From the fire drakes of Mercury to the ice crawlers of Pluto, he'd bagged them all. Except, of course, a Martian. That particular game was forbidden now. He sprawled in his chair, big and strong and ruthless, still a young man. He dwarfed the unkempt room with his size and the hard-held dynamo strength in him, and his cold green gaze dominated the trader. "It's illegal, you know," said Wisby. "It's a 20-year sentence if you're caught at it." "Ah, the Martian commissioner is on Ares, halfway around the planet. If we go at it right, who's ever to know?" Riordan gulped at his drink. "I'm well aware that in another year or so they'll have tightened up enough to make it impossible. This is the last chance for any man to get an owlie. That's why I'm here." Wisby hesitated, looking out the window. Port Armstrong was no more than a dusty huddle of domes, interconnected by tunnels in a red waste of sand stretching to the near horizon. An Earthman in an airsuit and transparent helmet was walking down the street, and a couple of Martians were lounging against a wall. Otherwise, nothing. A silent, deadly monotony brooding under the shrunken sun. Life on Mars was not especially pleasant for a human. You're not falling into this owlie loving that's corrupted all Earth?" demanded Riordan contemptuously. "Oh, no," said Wisby. "I keep them in their place around my post. But times are changing. It can't be helped." "There was a time when they were slaves," said Riordan. "Now those old women on Earth want to give 'em the vote." He snorted. "Well, times are changing," repeated Wisby mildly. "When the first humans landed on Mars 100 years ago, Earth had just gone through the Hemispheric Wars. The worst wars man had ever known. They damn near wrecked the old ideas of liberty and equality. People were suspicious and tough. They had to be to survive. They weren't able to empathize the Martians, or whatever you call it. Not able to think of them as anything but intelligent animals. And Martians made such useful slaves. They needed so little food or heat or oxygen. They can even live 15 minutes or so without breathing at all. And the wild Martians made fine sport. Intelligent game that could get away as often as not, or even manage to kill the hunter." "I know," said Riordan. "That's why I want to hunt one. It's no fun if the game doesn't have a chance." "It's different now," went on Wisby. "Earth has been at peace for a long time. The liberals have gotten the upper hand. Naturally, one of their first reforms was to end Martian slavery." Riordan swore. The forced repatriation of Martians working on his spaceships had cost him plenty. "I haven't time for your philosophizing," he said. "If you can arrange for me to get a Martian, I'll make it worth your while." "How much worth it?" asked Wisby. They haggled for a while before settling on a figure. Riordan had brought guns and a small rocket boat, but Wisby would have to supply radioactive material and a hawk and a rockhound. Then he had to be paid for the risk of legal action, though that was small. The final price came high. "Now, where do I get my Martian?" inquired Riordan. He gestured at the two in the street. "Catch one of them and release him in the desert?" It was Wisby's turn to be contemptuous. "One of them? Ha! Town loungers. A city dweller from Earth would give you a better fight." The Martians didn't look impressive. They stood only some 4 feet high, on skinny, claw-footed legs, and the arms ending in bony, four-fingered hands were stringy. The chests were broad and deep, but the waists were ridiculously narrow. They were viviparous, warm-blooded, and suckled their young, but gray feathers covered their hides. The round, hook-beaked heads, with huge amber eyes and tufted feather ears, showed the origin of the name owlie. They wore only pouched belts and carried sheath knives. Even the liberals of Earth weren't ready to allow the natives modern tools and weapons. There were too many old grudges. "The Martians always were good fighters," said Riordan. "They wiped out quite a few Earth settlements in the old days." "The wild ones," agreed Wisby. "But not these. They're just stupid laborers, as dependent on our civilization as we are. You want a real old-timer, and I know where there's one to be found." He spread a map on the desk. "See? Here in the Hraffinian Hills, about 100 miles from here. These Martians live a long time, maybe 2 centuries, and this fellow Kreega has been around since the first Earthmen came. He led a lot of Martian raids in the early days, but since the general amnesty and peace, he's lived all alone up there, in one of the old ruined towers. A real old-time warrior who hates Earthmen's guts. He comes here once in a while with furs and minerals to trade, so I know a little about him." Wisby's eyes gleamed savagely. "You'll be doing us all a favor by shooting the arrogant bastard. He struts around here as if the place belonged to him, and he'll give you a run for your money." Riordan's massive dark head nodded in satisfaction. The man had a bird and a rockhound. That was bad. Without them, Kreega could lose himself in the labyrinth of caves and canyons and scrubby thickets. But the hound could follow his scent, and the bird could spot him from above. To make matters worse, the man had landed near Kreega's tower. The weapons